This is Beyond the Big Screen podcast with your host, Steve Guerra.
We are talking about the 1998 movie Elizabeth, starring Cate Blanchett as Elizabeth, Queen of England during the very busy 16th century. This movie has so much background and historical context to it and introduces so many different characters and politics. We needed an expert like Heather Teysko of the Renaissance English History podcast to help us sort it all out. Elizabeth is the type of movie I think is perfect for this podcast because there's just so much going on behind the scenes. Thank you so much for joining us, Heather.
Hey, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
And Heather, of course, is the creator of the Renaissance English History podcast, which she started way back in 2009. That's like you're a godfather of podcasting, starting all the way back in 2009.
Yeah, I think I've been using some good anti-aging cream or something to keep it young.
She's always been fascinated by history, and her first job in high school was actually as the student docent in the Revolutionary War era home of General Edward Hand, one of Washington's adjutant generals. And even 25 years later, she still has most of the tour memorized. That's pretty fascinating. You still have the tour memorized?
Yeah. Rockford Foundation was built, the Rockford Plantation, the home was built between 1792 and 1794. You can see it's built in the Georgian style right here along the Conestoga River. I'll stop.
All right. You obviously did that once or twice. After your graduate studies in Los Angeles, you moved to London to really immerse yourself in choral music and history. What got you into choral music and history?
Well, actually, it's interesting because a lot of people who are into Renaissance history came at it through the history side, and I came at it through the music side because I was very fortunate to have gone to a high school that had a great music program. And in one of our chamber choirs, like many high school students that are in chamber choirs, we sang William Byrd's Ave Verum Corpus, which is a very famous piece of choral music that, like I said, they sing all over the place. But the thing that really struck me about this piece of music was I learned that William Byrd was a recusant Catholic living during the reign of Elizabeth, which this ties in nicely to what we're talking about today. So I became fascinated with the idea of an artist who had to cover up his religion, essentially, to work under a monarch, a patron that had a completely different religion, and that you could have been killed for that. And I don't know, it appealed to like the inner teenage rebel in me or something like that. But for whatever reason, I just became fascinated by the history of the time period through the music and how the music was an expression of what was going on there. So that was my kind of backdoor into history.
Right, well, that's great. That's definitely a different way to get into history. Now, this movie, Elizabeth, as we said, it was filmed in 1998, or it was actually released in 1998 by director Shekhar Kapoor. It has a runtime of 124 minutes. It looked and felt very much like an old-time movie, like A Man for All Seasons and some of the other older Elizabethan movies, which I thought was actually pretty cool. And it was nominated for 7 Academy Awards, and it only won the Best Makeup Design. It has pretty high Rotten Tomatoes and Metacritics, like the mid-80s, high 70s. What did you think of just the general setting and background?
I thought that there was a lot of drama around Elizabeth's early reign, and it captured that quite well. I think a lot of the parts of the way it was filmed wasn't necessarily like the halls looked like medieval. I remember there was like one scene where Elizabeth was sitting at this table and there were like 2 candles in the fireplace, and that was it. And I don't think it really showed the kind of splendor and extravagance that the Tudor monarchs had at this point. And it really looked like it was more of, I don't know, like a 13th century kind of thing. I don't think it really captured what the living situation was. And in terms of also the people, Walsingham played a big role. Lord Cecil, Lord Burghley played a key role. Those people weren't at her court in the beginning of that time period. And also portraying Walsingham as somebody who killed somebody. I mean, there was just a lot of things there. We'll get into it, but like, she knew Robert Dudley was married. She went to his wedding. So there was a lot of kind of stuff there that was just thrown in, I guess, for the drama of it. But I feel like you didn't have to have done all of that because it's very dramatic as it is anyway. I feel like they took something that was really super dramatic and then they threw a whole bunch of inaccuracies at it to make it even more dramatic. And to me, I just found it then confusing.
Let's talk a little bit about, before we even get into the cast, let's talk a little bit about the whole context of Elizabethan England. What was the story behind the story?
Well, with the ascension of Elizabeth, it goes way back. The original founding of the Tudor dynasty was when Henry VII, Henry Tudor, who had a very tenuous claim to the throne. He only had any claim at all because the nobility all killed themselves during the Wars of the Roses, and he beat the Yorkist Richard III at Bosworth Field. So he had the dynasty in its early days was very tenuous, didn't have a very good grip on the throne at all. And then Henry VIII came along, and he desperately needed a son to keep the dynasty going. And it's very ironic that, the two queens who were very powerful women during this time were his daughters, and the son that he had only ruled for, 6 years and didn't really do that much or have that much of a lasting legacy. So anyway, Henry needed to have a son, he thought, and he broke away from the church, as we all kind of probably know. But his breaking away from the church wasn't as clear cut as saying, okay, I'm going to be Protestant. We're going to have a Protestant church. He stayed a Catholic in practice for his entire life. And in fact, he was still executing Protestants even as he died. Anne Askew was one of the last Protestants that he executed. And, if you didn't believe in transubstantiation and all of the Catholic rites, you were deemed a heretic. So Henry, while we like to think that he founded the Church of England, he wasn't a Protestant by any sense of the word. And so then it really left England in this really tumultuous kind of place because of the fact that he then had 3 children by 3 different wives who were all raised in different sorts of ways religiously. And 2 of them died after very short reigns. So by the time you get to Elizabeth, who's the third in line, you've gone from having Henry VIII, who's a Protestant in name only, not even in name. He's completely Catholic, just doesn't want the Pope. So you have that. Then you switch to Edward, who was raised Protestant, who was extremely Protestant, and you see this immediate whitewashing of every kind of vestige of Catholicism anywhere. They break stained glass windows, they destroy altars. It's just a very systematic destruction of Catholicism, really. They try very hard to get rid of that. Then you have Mary, which is what we see the opening here. And she goes the other way. She, of course, blames the Protestants. She was the daughter of Catherine of Aragon. She blames the Protestants for essentially ruining her life. And she has a pretty serious bone to pick with Protestants. And we remember her as Bloody Mary. Now, that's not entirely fair to her. And I don't like the way this movie portrays her in that way, because the fact is that under Elizabeth, torture was used more than any other period in English history. And Elizabeth killed many, many, many Catholics as well. Just portraying Mary as Bloody Mary, it's just she did it all very quickly in a short span of time. And that's kind of the main thing that we remember her by, whereas Elizabeth gets the whole Spanish Armada thing. But anyway, so then you've got Mary, who's totally Catholic, and then you've got Elizabeth, who tries to bridge the gap with that. And that's like kind of what I think this movie tries to show with the different acts she passed for the common prayer and everything like that, the act of uniformity. And that's the sort of backstory that when Elizabeth comes to the throne, it's hugely tumultuous. People don't know what to believe. And I think it's interesting, and stop me if I'm talking too long here, but I think it's interesting that, we now live in a more secular society, right? And so we can look at this and say, well, what's the big deal? So you're Protestant, so you're not. This is people's immortal soul here. This is a really big deal for people. And I often think about if you were somebody who was born in 1520 and you could reasonably live for 50 or 60 years, you would have gone through being completely Catholic to being Henry's version of Catholic to being Protestant to being Catholic to being Elizabeth, 5 versions of Christianity. And you would have remembered all of them. And this whole thing of, how did people, I'm fascinated by how people tried to make that work in their minds. And, I looked at it from the music side of things and the artistic side, but that's what's going on in England at this time. And I think that's the kind of overriding thing that's happening. And you've got these courtiers and people who are trying to be advisors who are all jostling for power. And for them, losing power isn't even so much that they're going to lose power. It's that they could be killed because that's the other part of this. Like if you believe the wrong thing, you could get killed for that. There's no freedom of religion as we understand it. So it's a very high stakes and very tumultuous scene that's happening here.
So that really was a tumultuous situation. Like you said, there was so much going on and things that maybe Henry didn't necessarily expect to happen. Mm-hmm. Elizabeth was born into, would she have ever expected in a million years to have been the queen?
It's hard to say. I think she would have expected it once her brother died, because it was clear that Mary wasn't in good health. Mary had always been quite sick. Even when she was younger, she was really frail and always had a number of maladies, which is to be expected given what her situation was with her being moved around from house to house and having to be Elizabeth's servant and everything like that. So I think that by the time Edward died, she might have expected it was going to come her way.
What was the situation? They didn't really get into this in the movie. Would in other European countries a woman go and become the king or, the sovereign of the country? What was maybe different about England in that way?
Well, it's interesting because there is a book that just came out. Well, it's been almost a year now by a historian called Sarah Gristwood, and it's called Game of Queens. And she talks a lot about how the 16th century was this age of queenship in many different countries. So in Europe, you have Margaret of Austria, you have Catherine de Medici, you have a lot of different Margaret of Navarre. There's a lot of different women who, even though they aren't the actual sovereign themselves, they are reigning, they are regents, or they are protectors while the kings are younger. This was and for some reason, just the stars aligned, and there were a number of very powerful women in Europe at this time. And of course, women could not actually, there was Salic law in France, so women could not actually become the monarch themselves, but they could be like the protector if the king was young. And we see that happening in a number of situations throughout Burgundy and the Low Countries, and it all, of course, starting off this whole sort of the long 16th centuries with Ferdinand and Isabella. And Isabella was, a sovereign herself of Castile. And I think that's part of the reason why Catherine of Aragon never actually really saw the issue of having a son quite in the same way that Henry VIII had, because her mother ruled in her own right and was a warrior queen. And so I think it's interesting that throughout Europe at this time, there are actually a number of very powerful women. And the book, if people are interested in it, it's a really interesting book that goes into detail about all these different relationships that these women had. But the thing with England is that England had a woman who was wanted to be queen back in the 12th century with Matilda, and it's a period of that they called the anarchy, because you can imagine how that went down, which was that it didn't go down very well, and there was a period of civil war and everything like that, and that was the last experience with a queen that England had. So you can imagine that for Henry, the idea of leaving a woman in charge was sort of a scary thought to him.
The movie's really about the two main characters. There's many, many characters in this movie, but the two main ones are Cate Blanchett and Geoffrey Rush. Cate Blanchett obviously playing Elizabeth, and then Geoffrey Rush playing Francis Walsingham. Mm-hmm. One thing that seemed a little disjointed about the movie is that Walsingham was portrayed as somebody much, much, much older than Elizabeth, but in reality, wasn't he only about a year older than her?
Yeah, and you know what the thing was, he wasn't at court at this time. Like I said, he didn't show up at court until I think it was the 1570s or so, and he really rose to prominence after the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in France, and he had this whole period where he really started to see the Catholic threat, and he rose through the ranks there. But he wasn't at court at this period, and yes, he was. So by the time he was the age that it shows him in this movie, Elizabeth would have been that age as well.
This movie actually focuses in on the first half or the first chunk of her life. Well, she is a younger pre-queen, and then just after she becomes queen. This would have been a time where anybody, let alone a royal, would have been trying to get married and establish themselves, especially a royal dynastically. What was her situation with trying to find somebody, a suitable suitor, if you will?
Well, it's interesting. This is one of the things where I think Mary paved the way for Elizabeth. Elizabeth was very intelligent, and Elizabeth was really politically canny, and she saw the pitfalls that her sister had gone through as queen, and she benefited by not making the same mistakes and by learning from them. And one of the things that Mary did was she got married to a foreign prince. That creates all kinds of problems because, to start with, a woman is supposedly ruled by her husband. And so when Mary married, was Philip, there was all this talk about, was he going to then be king of England, and where would he be in charge? And they had this whole thing. They had a big marriage contract saying that if she died and they didn't have any children, he would go back. He wouldn't have any claim to the English throne. They made coins showing both her and him and the crown floating over top both of their heads because they didn't want to have one over the other. It was a really bad, and it was also part of what led to Wyatt's rebellion, which is why Elizabeth was in prison, and how it opened up very early on. People were very afraid of having a foreign prince, especially one who was Catholic and who, didn't particularly like England all that much. So I think that was the first thing for Elizabeth. If she was going to make a foreign match, who would it be? Would it be somebody Protestant, and the dynastic issues that there would be if she had a son and the son then ruled England, would the son, but say she had married into France and then the son had a claim to the French throne, or maybe she married a younger brother of France and so the son didn't have the claim to the French throne, but he did in England, and so then you've got two brothers who are kings of England and France, and it just gets very, very messy. And then if she would have married at home, well, you can only imagine the political crap storm that would have came out of that. Please feel free to edit that out. But with all of these people vying for power, and you saw it happen with Robert Dudley in the movie, and to a certain extent that happened in real life, that he was seen as her favorite, and there was a big backlash against that. It wouldn't, and also, how can a person, and it all comes down to the woman being ruled by her husband. How can a courtier be, or how can even a nobleman, how can a duke be in charge of the monarch? And that's the big question that women had to deal with at that time with marriage. That was the big question that she had to deal with. And I think she solved it in the most elegant way that she could.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking throughout the whole movie, not really knowing too much about Elizabeth's background in detail, as she definitely had the problem, she's a queen, so she's got to find somebody appropriate. And Robert Dudley, played by Joseph Fiennes, was her main love interest in the movie, but it always seemed like he didn't bring much to the dynastic party. Was that a concern at the time?
Well, he was married, so there wasn't going to be...
Well, that's another issue.
So I don't know that she ever really seriously thought about marrying him anyway. And he came from a noble family, but still he wasn't going to be some, really powerful magnate who was going to bring this dynastic whatever. So she was in a tough pickle there.
Was there anybody from the homeland, so to speak, who could have helped her in her reign? A suitor from inside of England?
There was some talk. Now, I don't know. We might have to edit this out because there was some talk about some cousins. The problem was even going back to the Wars of the Roses, all the big families had died and were still building themselves back up at this point. We're like 2 generations into it. So she had 2 aunts who lived, and one married into Scotland, the other married into France, and then after the French king died, she married Charles Brandon, a local person. So there were potentially cousins there that she could have married. But Henry VIII did a really good job killing off all of the Yorkists who had any claim to the throne. And there weren't really any of those old noble families left anymore that would have provided the same kind of marriage sort of cred that, for example, Elizabeth of York provided to Henry Tudor. So there really wasn't anybody that she could have. There was talk about her marrying into potentially Scotland. There really wasn't anybody in England, no.
In the movie, they show her and they're trying to set her up with Henri, Duc d'Anjou.
Yeah.
But he's kind of a party animal, and she was into it. She was being portrayed as not being entirely into it, but they portrayed Henry or Henri as like a cross-dressing, like party animal, French aristocrat, maybe of an era like 200 years after that, maybe not somebody who would particularly fit in that area. And I don't think that there was anything to say that Henri was like that. But was that an actual abortive attempt at her to get married during that time period?
Yeah, there was actually, it wasn't Henri, it was Francis, it was the brother, and it was Francois, the Duke of Anjou, and I don't know how to pronounce this French C with the little thing, the little tail, Alençon, whatever. He was the Duke of Anjou.
I think it's like
yeah, that thing. So, and he actually, it was the closest that she came to marrying. He came in person to court her. And, she really liked him, I think, a lot. And they seemed to get along, and they seemed to have a really good time and to enjoy. And he was the only one who ever came in person to court her in person. And they actually did come up with a treaty that they were going to get married. The problem was that he was a Catholic, and this was right around the time of the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre that I mentioned before and how that affected Walsingham. That sent shockwaves throughout Europe, and I think that kind of had a lot to do with them not getting married.
Was Elizabeth any particular brand of Protestant at that point, or was she really just not Catholic?
No, actually, interestingly, she was more Catholic. She was like her father. And from a musical standpoint, the music of this time period is often called the golden age of Elizabethan choral music because she brought back Latin, she brought back polyphony. And the actual services themselves, the liturgy was much more Protestant, but she herself personally, she kept a choir that was her own personal choir, and she really fell for a lot of the sorts of trappings of tradition that her father did. But in terms of what the liturgy was in the service, it was much more Protestant.
What was the main conflict of her life at that point? What were the movie portrays it as this struggle against the Catholics, particularly the Pope, and a cabal of Catholics inside of England. How accurate was that? And what was the story behind that?
I think that became more accurate after what we see at the end, the rebellion of the Northern Earls, and that was after that was an attempt, I think, that they were going to make Mary Queen of Scots queen, and they captured Durham Cathedral and actually held a mass there, and that was about 15 years into her reign. I think in the first little bit, it was establishing herself. She was young. She was in her, early to mid 20s, and trying to establish herself as a player and not to be forced into marriage. That was a big part of her early reign as well. Was she going to get married? Was she not? But the real, this was early on too, was when she had supposedly made the famous quote about not making windows into men's souls. And she really thought that she could come to a peace with the Catholics. And it wasn't until later on, and with Mary Queen of Scots and with the Jesuit priests coming back and Walsingham's spy network, that they really started to see Catholics. And plus she was excommunicated and there was a papal bull against her. And that all happened later on in her reign.
And now, a brief word from our sponsors. We talked a little bit about what the situation was between Catholics and Protestants in England. Do you have any detailed stories of, like, what were some of the things that they were actually doing to each other at that point?
Well, what were they doing? I know that like I said this was the highest use of torture in any time in English history. And so there was the Jesuits were founded, and they were sending priests back into England. And so they were trying to educate more priests, and everything they were doing was completely illegal. There were fines for not going to church, but recusants would pay those fines if they were wealthy. Other people would it's interesting, people would cross their fingers behind their back when they were taking communion, or, when they were, in the Protestant services. And so they actually would have these little holes in the roofs of the church so people could spy down and see who was crossing their fingers or not. So, who was like faking it kind of. So there was a lot of, it was a period where people were kind of telling on their neighbors, and their servants were telling on the people they worked for, if they were celebrating Catholic masses. And this was one of the interesting stories about this period that I really love, is this was the period of the priest holes. So there was, for example, a really famous architect called Nicholas Owen, he specialized in building priest holes. And he used this amazing mathematical know-how, because he would create these hideaways for priests, so that if a priest was staying with a Catholic family and the authorities were alerted and they came, the priest could go and hide right away. And he did things like creating fake fireplaces that had he would make them dirty so it looked like a real fireplace. And he would put fake windows, because they would be outside counting the windows, and to make sure there wasn't a hidden place, so he would use fake windows. And the stuff he did was genius. I don't think they've still found all of his priest holes. They found one about 100 years ago, was the most recent one I think they found. But it's a period of people having to hide that kind of stuff. And I think there was that scene in the movie where they showed, there was that scene in the movie where they showed how they had opened up the step, and there were people celebrating a mass in this secret room, and that's because of that was actually done. And Nicholas Owen and other architects, and Nicholas Owen was captured and he was tortured, and he never said where all of his priest holes were. And I think he's credited for having saved the lives of hundreds of Catholics because of his architecture. How about that for a tangent?
Well, that's fascinating. And I had no idea that that's where crossing your fingers comes from, like canceling out.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I don't know if it comes from that, but certainly by that point, people were doing that.
Yeah, that's fascinating. The main bad guy in the film is Thomas Howard, the fourth Duke of Norfolk, or Norfolk.
Yeah.
What was the role he played in that whole situation?
Well, he was the one who, I just want to make sure I have this right. Yeah, he led the Northern Rebellion, and he had this whole idea that maybe he would marry Mary Queen of Scots and create a dynasty that way. He was just kind of up to no good. And the Howard family kind of has this history of treason. I guess it's not difficult at this point to get it. When you switch sides so often, different families are going to wind up, if they're powerful at all. But the Howards have a history of doing all kinds of plotting. They were an older family, and I think they saw themselves in grander light than the Queen saw them. And so he was involved in this plot to marry Mary Queen of Scots and the Northern Rising of I forget the actual name, like the Great Northern Rising of the northern earls or something like that. It was the one where they, 1569, I believe it was, where they said mass in Durham Cathedral. And so he was involved in that.
England was generally in a pretty sad state of affairs at that point. They were riding pretty high not too long before that, but they were fairly much a third-rate power in Europe. Is that accurate to say?
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah, I mean, I think Henry the Eighth had built up a great navy, but there were all these domestic issues going on that maybe the other countries like the Empire, the Holy Roman Empire and Spain didn't necessarily have. But France wasn't in a really particularly good place at this point either that I can think of. I don't really think a lot of people were in a good place at this point, but England certainly had a lot of domestic issues and I think it's part of the switching back and forth with the religions and it's true that they didn't have that much money. It kind of got squandered away when Henry tried to build up a navy and make war with France. So there wasn't a lot of money, and it was a very small country as well. It was the smallest of the big European countries too. So, yeah.
Is it maybe part of the narrative that Elizabeth takes a country that's on hard times and then brings it to the glory that then it leads into colonization and the big navy and all that?
Yeah, I think it's interesting, because certainly Elizabeth was brilliant at propaganda and telling her story in a specific kind of way. And I think she liked that idea of it fit in with the Gloriana. And I think it's true that after the Armada, England really established itself. It wasn't so much that they were so bad to start with. It was after the Armada that they suddenly became really, really great. And she kind of took that and ran with it.
Maybe we can talk a little bit about the plot to assassinate Elizabeth. The movie makes it as sort of an almost Godfather-esque story of, this plotting, and then Walsingham figures it all out, and then they go and take out everybody who's in the plot. Is that, was there actually a plot to assassinate Elizabeth early in her reign?
Yeah, I definitely her life was in danger when Mary was still the queen. But I think by this point, until they had a viable alternative with Mary, Queen of Scots, I don't think her life, who would have replaced her? I don't know that there would have been anybody right there. And while there were certainly people who were discontent with it, I don't think there was a serious, like that scene where she's on the boat and the arrow comes at her. That didn't happen like that. There was an accident with an arrow later on in her reign, and it wasn't somebody trying to shoot her. It was like it just was an arrow that went wrong, and it didn't hit her. It like hit somebody else. And so there was like an arrow incident. But it wasn't, it wasn't that. And there certainly were some assassinations in Europe at this point. And again, this was between the Catholics and the Protestants. But I don't think her life was in such imminent danger at this point as they make it out to be.
And like you said, there didn't seem to be a real viable alternative to her anyways.
Yeah. So I don't know what anybody would have gained from that. The Catholics, I mean, perhaps what they would have done, I think there was a threat from Philip of Spain. He actually, early on in the reign, wanted to marry Elizabeth. He'd been married to Mary, and she died, and he did want to marry Elizabeth because he still wanted to be the king, and he thought, that there would be a way to get them back into Catholicism if he married her. So once she had made that clear that she wasn't going to marry him, there could have been a threat there. But even from him, if she had died, it's not like he would have had any claim to being able to be king then. So certainly that early on, I don't know who the big beneficiaries would have been of her death. Perhaps some minor nobility who were Catholics who wanted to. Mary, Queen of Scots, did start displaying the English coat of arms with her own and staking her claim, but that was also largely due to the French telling her that she should. I don't know that she actually really wanted it at that point.
I kind of felt, and there was some criticism at the time, that the movie portrayed the non-English characters, they kind of highlighted the negativity on them, and the Catholic characters were like arch villains. Is that something that the propaganda of the day was doing, was maybe trying to zero in on foreigners and foreignness?
Yeah, definitely. This was a time of, well, Wyatt's rebellion in part was because of the Mary marrying Philip, and the big fear. It's so interesting because to me it speaks. It's so similar to the situation that I think Europe and the US is going through right now with the discussions about refugees and what makes us us, and what makes the US special, what makes Western Europe special, what is our soul. The big fear at this time was that people were posing as Protestant refugees. There were a lot of Protestant refugees coming in during this period, fleeing the wars in Germany and in France. And people were coming in, and on one hand, people recognized that these were refugees who shared the same religion and wanted to assimilate and be part of their country. But there was this really big fear that people were posing as Protestant refugees, they were actually Catholic, and they were coming in specifically to hide out and to pretend they were okay and pretend that they were, assimilating. But then as soon as war with Spain started, which it was pretty clear, that it was going to come to that at some point, that as soon as that came up, these people were going to rise up and be an internal army who were going to, kill English people. And I think a lot of this, like I mentioned before, the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre really solidified that fear for Protestants in England. And if people don't know what it is, it's it was sparked by a marriage in France where a Protestant was marrying a Catholic, and all the different people got together for the marriage, and it turned into a several weeks long bloodbath where Catholics paraded through the streets killing Protestants all over the country. And there were tens of thousands, even higher than that by some estimates, hundreds of thousands of Protestants who were killed in France during this period. And like I said, it lasted for several weeks. And so you saw that happen, and you saw Walsingham was in Paris when that happened, and he just barely escaped with his life. And people came back to England, and refugees came into England telling these stories of these massacres and these Catholics who were killing Protestants, so like a party atmosphere, and people were so afraid of that. So then you see more and more Protestant refugees coming, and people were really afraid that there were Catholics in their midst who were planning on rising up and having another St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in England. And that was a really big fear for people at the time. And it was something that sadly the Catholics in England had to pay for that, because even though they might have been completely loyal to Elizabeth, the Catholics in France and it wasn't, also to be clear, it wasn't every Catholic in France was out killing Protestants. It was a group of thugs who, got crazy, and then it started spreading. And that it was one of the overriding fears that people had at this point, that was going to happen in England.
And I guess that this was the time, too, where, like you said, there was the 30 Years' War going on, where Catholics and Protestants are basically slaughtering each other on a daily basis. And this is the rise of nationalism. So was there a point in England where the nationalism conflicted with maybe looking out for their co-religionists?
Yeah, by the late 1580s or so, they started passing some rules, keeping people out. And also the other part of it was the economics. People were afraid, that they were going to come in and take all the jobs, because a lot of the people, if you had the means to get to England at that point, you were probably skilled in something, because just average people weren't probably going to be able to figure out how to get to England. And so people were afraid that they were going to take their jobs. And so there was a big protectionist movement going on at that point too. And so I think they might have said, well, we'd like to help, but we have to look out. It's just like deja vu, with what people are saying now and what you're hearing now. And I don't mean to get political on it. It's just like literally the words are the same things that, we'd like to help. It's a shame these people are going through this. We feel really bad for them, but we have to protect our country first. And that's kind of where that came, how they dealt with that.
Yeah, that seems like something that especially during certain times in history, it comes and goes, that idea of how much do you help out people who you want to help out, but you're also trying to cover your own interests, we might say.
Yeah, and there was this fear that they were going to rise up, that Philip was going to give the order, and boom, you'd have several tens of thousands of Catholics armed, killing all the Protestants in the towns. And so that was a very real fear that people had.
Well, I should say, too, I probably should have said this in the beginning, that this was we chose this movie, Elizabeth, based on a poll that you did on your website and through your Facebook group.
Yeah.
What are some other movies you think that are emblematic of this time period?
Well, let's see. I should look at the list of what everybody said. Anne of a Thousand Days was another one that I think came in second. There was the movie, oh gosh, what's it called? It's the one with Helena Bonham Carter, and she's Lady Jane Grey. I forget what it's called, but
it might have even been called Lady Jane.
Yeah, maybe that was it. And A Man for All Seasons was definitely high up there as well. So those are some kind of... Elizabeth R. was also one of the ones that people voted for a lot. And then, of course, the sequel to this, the Golden Age, was also high up there.
Like I said, I want to hold you to coming back on for Elizabeth, the Golden Age. But they set up at the end of this movie and they say, now is the beginning of the Golden Age of England. By what standard was this a golden age? Was that, again, a propaganda item? And now, a brief word from our sponsors.
Yeah, I think that you can make a case for it with the arts. Countries that are at war with themselves don't really have a lot of extra money to, patronize the arts and also send out ships to explore new lands. And so England did come to exploration very late and colonization very late. You have the Cabots were sent out by Henry VII. Sebastian and John Cabot, they were sent out in the late 15th century. But after that, there's not really much going on in the whole exploration world until Elizabeth and Walter Raleigh and Francis Drake and all of that kind of stuff. And the same goes for the arts. There's some, there were always composers who were composing for the services, the liturgy. But then as you get into the Elizabethan period, you have like the rise of like madrigals and really beautiful new works for the new kinds of services that are coming in the Book of Common Prayer and the evensong services and all these kinds of things. So I think just the fact that England was going to be at peace, and also that she had such a long and stable reign. Henry VIII had a long reign, and then but even his reign was filled with uncertainty and war. And I think once Elizabeth was able to take care of the Spanish threat and the Mary Queen of Scots threat, then the 1590s and that period became a real, and then the succession of the Stuart line, with it being very peaceful and not having a war about it, was definitely, I think, part of a golden age as well.
There must have been at some point a feeling of apprehension or nervousness because she wasn't married and didn't have an issue. At what point were people starting to get a little concerned of what was going to happen when she was no longer around?
I don't think people really got concerned once it became clear that she wasn't going to have issue, that she was never going to marry. I think people realized it was going to be James. She never announced it as James. People begged her to. people said, you need to say it so that people know. And she always was just kind of like, people know, why do I need to say it? And her whole thing was she didn't want that pressure on somebody else being made a figurehead. She's like, I'm still queen. As long as I'm queen, there shouldn't be another king here. Like, it's me. I'm queen, and y'all can deal with that because y'all know what's going on. It's clear, and I'm not going to name him because I don't need to, kind of thing, I think is what she was thinking.
How did her relationships with other countries settle in as her reign progressed?
I think it became clear. For a while there, the Catholic countries saw an opportunity to, kind of conquer. When she was excommunicated, then it became a free-for-all. The Pope said nobody has to feel like they have to obey her. You can do whatever you want, basically, because she's not part of the church. So a lot of the Catholic countries wanted to move against her. And as soon as she made it clear that that wasn't going to happen, then I think things settled back in, and she was able to have more productive relationships with people.
As a movie, what are your final takeaways of this watching, and what did you think as somebody who spent a good portion of your life studying these things? What did you think about it as a film that represents that time period?
Yeah, I didn't understand why they added so much drama that didn't need to be there. And I wish that they would have made clear the timeline progression too, because it makes it look as if it's all that it's all happening kind of right after her reign or right after she became queen. And the whole progression of that movie is a decade and a half or longer. And I wish that they would have. I mean, I don't know. I wasn't really thrilled with it.
Yeah, I think that there was something going on that maybe the writers or the directors were going for something that didn't come across right. It just seemed like there was like some undercurrent to the movie that I didn't get. And I think that needed to be maybe a little bit more explicit. Yeah.
I did definitely like the portrayal of Elizabeth as intelligent as she was. Because she was, like I said, I think one of the reasons her reign so early on was as successful as it was that she was able to look at what happened with Mary and learn from that and not make the same mistakes. So I think that in that respect, it was good that it showed her that it showed that she wasn't going to be bowed to any man. I just was losing it at the end because they show her saying that she's going to be the virgin queen and all of that. At that point in her reign, there was still marriage negotiations going on. She didn't take on that Gloriana virgin queen thing until the late 1580s or so. So I really kind of had a hard time watching that. I was like, no, stop it. Just stop it. But I really like how they portrayed her as a strong woman, because I like seeing strong women in film and history.
You also host a podcast where you're doing something very similar to this podcast, where you're looking at each of the episodes of The Tudors. What was the genesis of that podcast?
I was talking with somebody else, another podcaster, and he was talking about different ways of growing listenership and stuff. And he said, like, for example, I watched that show, The Tudors, and there was this one particular scene, and it's kind of a graphic scene, so I won't talk about it in detail. But he was like, I saw this scene and I wondered, like, did that really happen? Could that have happened? And he's like, somebody should do, maybe that would be a place for you to do a podcast. And so I thought that was a good idea. And then my husband does it with me because he literally knows nothing about this period in history at all. And it's funny, one of the iTunes reviews says, like, he really has to be an idiot if he's been married to her for 11 years and he hasn't picked up on any of her stuff yet, because literally he knows nothing. And it was funny because I read him that and he was like, yeah, I guess I kind of am an idiot. I don't know. I start to talk about it and his eyes glaze over. So we watch it together and he asks me questions about what was really happening and what wasn't. And it's interesting because so much of that show is about the drama of the Tudor court. And while I think that's interesting on a soap opera kind of level, it's not like what gets me in my gut, which is, the ideas of this time, and, the transition into a early modern period from a medieval period. And like, honestly, I don't really care who Charles Brandon is sleeping with. Like, it doesn't matter to me at all. But it's really fun to kind of go through and look at not just what was happening at the time, but then extrapolating out like what it would have meant for common people and for people in the country. And it's just interesting to think that a whole country had to change their belief in God and in their belief in purgatory and who was in charge and who had the direct relationship to God. Was it the Pope or was it Henry? That a whole country had to change that belief system because Henry wanted a divorce. And that's kind of interesting.
I think it's really an interesting topic for a show, because you're taking an entire television show that is historically based and breaking it down. And I think it's great that you have somebody who's kind of the foil, who doesn't know anything. And I think anybody who's married for any amount of time, situations come up like that all the time where you don't really know much about something that your spouse is particularly interested in. Do you think that has that helped? Do you think your husband has a better idea of the history now?
Oh yeah, it's really funny because he's really kind of getting into it now. Of course, he's getting the Tudors version of it, so I have to every once in a while I'll tell him something, and he'll be like, "Well, wait, how does that relate to the show? How?" And I'm like, "No, it doesn't. That was the court. That was like Hollywood. That was like the soap opera. Like I'm talking about people on their farms here and people in towns and blah 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 blah." And it's just interesting to kind of then piece those two sides together because he sees the dramatic portion
bringing
of the
families
court,
together.
and the stuff I'm into is much less dramatic,
more
I guess.
Podcasts for a better family
Together, right? Right. The family that podcasts together. And Hannah just did an episode of the Renaissance English History podcast with me because we did a great Tudor bake-along episode, and she helped me bake Tudor jumbles, and she's 3. So, do you ever bring your kids into your podcast?
Not yet. But I am working on something to bring the family together. If people keep tuned to this podcast, there might just be a family podcast.
A family movie night podcast?
Yeah, I think there might be.
How fun.
Thank you for listening to Beyond the Big Screen podcast. Of course, a big thanks goes out to Heather Teysko of the Renaissance English History podcast and Watching the Tudors podcast. Links to learn more about Heather and her wonderful and entertaining podcasts can be found at www.englandcast.com or in the show notes. If you would like to learn more about Beyond the Big Screen, see show notes, and connect to social media, go over to a2zhistorypage.com. I would love to hear your questions, comments, and feedback. We can talk movies, and I would definitely like to hear your ideas for future episodes, topics, or interesting guests. The email address is steve@a2zhistorypage.com. If you like what you hear, I would really appreciate you leaving the show a rating and review on iTunes or Apple Podcasts. Ratings and reviews really help a great deal to let me know what you think about the show and how to make the show better. iTunes reviews also let other people find out about the show. And of course, we will see you next time beyond the big screen.